I did not say another word for the rest of dinner, not when my mother kept talking about Emily's new kitchen with marble countertops, not when Emily described the backyard like it was something she had earned piece by piece, not even when my mother turned to me again and asked if I had any plans for the future, as if my entire life could be reduced to a question asked between passing plates of mashed potatoes. I simply nodded, smiled when expected, and let the evening move around me like a scene I was no longer fully part of, because my attention had shifted inward, quietly, methodically. I was remembering things I had ignored for years, small conversations, quick signatures, moments where I had trusted instead of questioned. And the more I thought about it, the more a pattern began to form, one that I could not unsee once it started. Later that night when I returned to my apartment, the silence felt different, heavier, as if it was waiting for me to finally pay attention. I placed my keys on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, staring at nothing, letting the events of the evening settle into something clearer, something more defined. Then I walked to my desk, opened the drawer where I kept my documents, and pulled out the folder I had not touched in months, maybe longer, my savings account statements, neatly stacked, organized in a way that used to make me feel responsible, in control. I sat down and began flipping through them slowly. At first there was nothing unusual, just the expected deposits, the steady growth I had built over 2 decades of careful living, skipped vacations, modest purchases, saying no to things I could have easily justified. All of it adding up to something I believed was secure, something that represented stability, independence. And then I saw it. A withdrawal that was larger than I remembered, not alarming on its own, but enough to make me pause. I turned the page, then another, and there it was again, another. Withdrawal, spaced months apart, explained at the time as adjustments, temporary reallocations, things my mother had assured me were necessary, smart even. I could hear her voice in my head as clearly as if she were standing beside me, telling me not to worry, telling me she was helping me manage things better, and I had believed her because that is what daughters do. They believe their mothers. I leaned back in my chair, the paper still in my hands, and for a moment I closed my eyes, not out of confusion, but out of recognition, because the numbers were not random, they were consistent, deliberate, each one small enough to avoid alarm. But together they formed something much larger, something that now had a shape, a purpose, and that purpose was sitting at a Christmas table earlier that evening, being praised and celebrated. I opened my eyes and looked at the final balance, the number that should have been higher, significantly higher, and I did the calculation in my head without even needing a calculator. Years of discipline had trained me well, and what I realized then was not just that money was missing, but that time was missing, effort was missing. Pieces of my life had been quietly transferred into something I had never agreed to, something I had never even been told about. I set the papers down carefully, aligning the edges as if order on the outside could somehow match the order I was forcing inside myself. And then I did something I had not done in a very long time. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number of the bank manager who had helped me open the account years ago. I hesitated for just a second, my thumb hovering over the screen, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that once I crossed this line, there would be no going back to the version of things I had accepted for so long. Then I pressed call, and as the line began to ring, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not yet, but something steadier, something colder, the quiet certainty that whatever had been taken from me was not gone forever, and that the people who believed I would never notice had made their first and most critical mistake. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was restless, but because my mind refused to stop organizing what I had just uncovered. Every number, every date, every small decision I had once trusted now lined up in a way that felt almost deliberate, almost designed. And by the time the morning light filtered through my curtains, I was no longer unsure. I was certain, not just that something had been taken, but that it had been done slowly enough to pass as care, as help, as something I should be grateful for. I made coffee the way I always did, measuring each scoop precisely, letting the routine ground me, because I understood that what came next required more than emotion. It required clarity, patience, and above all, control. When the bank manager finally returned my call later that morning, his voice carried the same polite familiarity I remembered, but there was a shift when I asked him to review my account history in detail. A pause that was just long enough to confirm that I was not imagining things. He explained the transactions carefully, each withdrawal authorized through a secondary access point, one that had been set up years ago, one that allowed limited control but had clearly been used far beyond its original purpose. I listened without interrupting, writing down everything he said, every term, every date, every confirmation, because I needed it all to be exact, to be undeniable. When I asked who had access, he hesitated again, not out of reluctance, but out of professional caution. And then he said it, my mother's name, spoken plainly, without accusation, without emotion, just a fact placed carefully between us. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat there, in silence, the confirmation settling into me not as a shock, but as something colder, something that had been waiting to be acknowledged. I thought about all the times my mother had reassured me, the way she would gently insist that she was helping me stay organized, the way she would smile when I thanked her, and I realized that the trust one had given her had not been broken in a single moment. It had been worn down over years, shaped into something she could use without resistance. And Emily. I thought about her too, about the way she had spoken at dinner, the ease in her voice, the lack of hesitation, and I understood then that this was not something new to her. This was something she had accepted, maybe even expected. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below, people moving through their routines, unaware of the quiet shift that had just taken place in my life, and I felt something settle into place inside me, not grief, not even anger, but a kind of resolve that felt steady and unshakable, because now that I knew the truth, I also understood the most important part of it. They believed I would do nothing. They believed I would continue as I always had, accommodating, trusting, silent, and that belief was their greatest weakness. I turned away from the window and went back to my desk, pulling the documents closer, organizing them into a new order, one that told the story clearly, one that could not be dismissed or explained away. And as I worked, I allowed myself one small, controlled breath, because this was no longer about what had been taken. It was about what I was going to do next, and for the first time since that dinner, I felt completely certain of one thing. I was not the same person they thought I was, and they were about to find out just how much they had underestimated me. I spent the rest of that afternoon building something I had never needed before, not a routine, not a habit, but a strategy, because for the first time in my life I understood that this was not a misunderstanding that could be solved with a conversation. This was something structured, something repeated, something that had been allowed to exist because I had never questioned it. And now that I was questioning it, I needed to be precise. I needed to be careful. I needed to be undeniable. I called the bank again, this time asking for full documentation, not summaries, not explanations, but every single record tied to my account over the past 20 years. The representative on the line sounded surprised at first, then professional, assuring me that the request would take a few days, that everything would be compiled and sent securely. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat back and let the silence return, but it was not the same silence as before. It was sharper now, more focused, like the quiet before something shifts permanently. My phone buzzed a few minutes later, a message from my mother, asking if I had gotten home safely, followed by another line about how nice it was to have everyone together again. I stared at the screen for a moment, reading the words twice, 3 times, not because I did not understand them, but because I was trying to understand the distance between what she said and what she had done. And then I typed a simple response. Yes, I am home. Dinner was lovely. Thank you. I pressed send and placed the phone face down on the table, because for now, normal was exactly what I needed them to believe. Over the next few days, I moved through my routine exactly as I always had. I went to work. I greeted people with the same calm smile. I made my coffee the same way every morning, measured, steady, unchanged. But underneath it all, I was collecting, organizing, preparing. When the documents from the bank finally arrived, I opened them slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what they represented. Page after page of transactions, signatures, authorization records, all laid out in a way that removed any doubt, any possibility of misunderstanding. I traced the timeline carefully, marking each withdrawal, each transfer, each moment where control had shifted without my full awareness, and the pattern became unmistakable. It had started small, almost invisible, then gradually increased, Not enough to raise alarm, but enough to build something substantial over time. Something that now stood in the form of a house I had never seen, but suddenly knew far too well. I noticed something else too. A secondary signature attached to several key transactions, not just my mother's, but another one. One that matched Emily's handwriting. And I paused there, letting that detail settle, because it confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. This had never been just one person's decision. This had been shared, discussed, agreed upon. I closed the folder gently and placed both hands flat on the table, grounding myself in the physical moment, because the weight of the realization could have easily pulled me somewhere emotional, somewhere reactive, but I refused to go there. Not yet. Emotion would come later, if it needed to, but right now what mattered was clarity, control, and timing. I stood up, walked to the window again, and looked out at the same quiet street, the same passing cars, the same ordinary world that had no idea what was unfolding behind closed doors, and I allowed myself one small, controlled breath, because everything I needed was now in front of me. Every detail, every proof, every piece of the truth that they believed I would never uncover. And as I turned away from the window, I understood something with complete certainty. They had built their confidence on the assumption that I would remain the same, that I would continue to trust, to accept, to stay silent. And that assumption had given them the freedom to take what they wanted, but it also meant they were completely unprepared for what would happen when I chose not to be that person anymore. And for the first time since this began, I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form, not out of satisfaction, but out of recognition, because I finally knew exactly where I stood, and more importantly, I knew exactly what they had given me without realizing it. The one thing they would never be able to take back. The advantage of knowing the truth before they knew that I knew. I did not rush into anything the next day or the day after that, because rushing was exactly what they would expect if I had discovered the truth, and I had no intention of giving them that kind of warning. Instead, I chose something much quieter, something that looked almost like acceptance from the outside. I called my mother and asked if I could come by for coffee later that week, my voice steady, my tone unchanged, and she sounded pleased, almost relieved, as if the distance between us had never existed, as if the dinner had meant nothing more than a passing comment. When I arrived at her house, everything looked exactly the same as it always had, the same framed photographs on the wall, the same soft scent of vanilla candles, the same carefully arranged living room that had always made me feel like I was stepping into a place where nothing bad could happen. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to see it the way I used to, before I reminded myself why I was there. She greeted me warmly, asking about my week, offering me coffee, moving through familiar gestures that once felt comforting but now felt rehearsed, like a performance she had perfected over time. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had once helped me sort through my first paycheck, teaching me about saving, about responsibility, about trust, and I almost smiled at the memory because of how completely it had been rewritten. "You have been quiet since Christmas," she said lightly, stirring her coffee without looking at me, and I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Just thinking about a few things," I replied, and she hummed softly, as if that answer satisfied her, as if she believed that my silence came from reflection rather than discovery. I let the conversation drift into ordinary topics, work, weather, small updates that meant nothing but filled the space in a way that made everything feel normal. And then, carefully, I introduced a single question, not direct, not confrontational, just enough to see how she would respond. "Emily must be really happy with the new house," I said, watching her closely. She smiled immediately, too quickly. "Oh, she is. It was such a good opportunity for her," she replied, her tone smooth, practiced, and I nodded again, letting a small pause settle between us before I asked. "It must have taken a lot to make that happen." And for the first time, she hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but enough for me to see the calculation behind her expression. "Well, sometimes family helps each other," she said finally, her eyes meeting mine with a look that was almost challenging, almost daring me to question it further. And in that moment, I understood something important. She was not unaware of what she had done. She was comfortable with it, comfortable enough to defend it if necessary, comfortable enough to believe she was justified. And I felt that same steady calm settle over me again, because this was exactly what I needed to see, not just the evidence on paper, but the certainty in her behavior, the quiet confidence that came from thinking she would never be held accountable. I leaned back slightly, taking a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth of it ground me in the present, and I smiled, just enough to match the tone she expected. "That is good," I said softly. "I am glad everything worked out." And she relaxed at that, visibly, her shoulders easing, her attention drifting away from me as if the moment of tension had passed, as if the conversation had confirmed what she believed all along, that I would accept, that I would move on, that I would remain exactly who I had always been. And as I finished my coffee and stood to leave, she walked me to the door with the same familiar warmth, reminding me to visit again soon, telling me to take care, and I nodded, thanking her, stepping out into the cool afternoon air with the same calm expression I had carried inside. But the moment I reached my car and closed the door behind me, I allowed that expression to fade, not into anger, but into something far more deliberate, because now I had everything I needed, not just the documents, not just the transactions, but the confirmation that they believed they were safe, that they believed the story was finished. And as I started the engine and pulled away from the house, I understood with complete clarity that the story was only just beginning, and this time, I would be the one deciding how it ended. The next morning, I did something I had never done before, not in all the years I had trusted quietly and lived carefully. I called a lawyer, not a friend, not family, but someone whose only role was to look at facts without emotion. And when I sat across from him later that afternoon, placing the folder on his desk, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. Not because this was easy, but because it was finally clear. He opened the documents one by one, his expression neutral, professional, the kind of face that does not react until it has something worth reacting to. And I watched as his eyes moved across the pages, pausing at certain points, marking details I had already memorized. When he finally looked up, there was no confusion in his expression, no hesitation, just a quiet confirmation that everything I had suspected was real. These transactions were not standard, he said carefully, choosing each word with precision. And based on what I see, you did not authorize most of them directly. I nodded, not needing reassurance, only validation. And he continued, explaining the options, the legal language precise but clear, words like unauthorized access, fiduciary responsibility, recovery of funds, each one landing with a weight that felt both heavy and necessary. I listened without interrupting, absorbing every detail, because this was no longer just about understanding what had happened. It was about deciding what would happen next. When he finished, he leaned back slightly and asked the one question that mattered most. "Do you want to pursue this formally?" And for a moment, just a moment, I thought about what that meant, not in terms of paperwork or process, but in terms of what it would change, the conversations that would follow, the way everything would shift once the truth was no longer hidden. And then I answered, my voice steady, "Yes," because there was no other answer that made sense anymore. He nodded once, as if he had expected that, and began outlining the next steps: documentation to file, notices to prepare, a timeline that would unfold carefully, methodically, without unnecessary noise. I left his office with a folder that was no longer just a collection of records. It was a plan, a structure, something that would move forward whether they were ready for it or not. And as I stepped outside into the late afternoon light, I felt that same quiet certainty return, stronger now, more defined, because everything was in motion. The next few days passed in a controlled rhythm, calls made, documents signed, each step small but deliberate. And through it all, I maintained the same outward routine, the same calm presence that had allowed everything to go unnoticed before. My mother called once, casually, asking if I wanted to come over again that weekend, and I agreed without hesitation, my voice warm, unchanged, because I understood something now that I had not understood before: the strength of silence, the power of letting people believe they are still in control. When I arrived at her house that weekend, Emily was there too, sitting comfortably in the living room, talking about paint colors and furniture, describing plans for a space that had never truly been hers. And I listened, smiling when appropriate, asking small questions that made it seem like I was interested, like I was proud. And they responded exactly as expected: relaxed, open, completely unaware of the shift that had already begun. At one point, Emily laughed and said, "It still does not feel real," and I nodded, meeting her eyes just long enough to let the words settle between us. "It will," I replied softly, and I meant it in a way she could not yet understand, because what was coming next would make everything feel very real, very quickly. And as the conversation continued around me, light, effortless, unchanged, I realized that this exact moment, was the last time things would ever feel this way for them. The last time they would sit comfortably in a version of the story that only existed because I had allowed it. And as I leaned back in my chair, listening, observing, saying very little, I understood with complete clarity that the balance had already shifted. They just had not noticed it yet. The first letter was sent on a quiet Tuesday morning, not with anger, not with accusation, but with precision, the kind that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. I watched the envelope slide across the counter at the courier office, addressed clearly, professionally, and for a moment I imagined the exact second it would be opened, the shift in expression, the pause before understanding, the moment when certainty begins to crack. And then I turned and walked out into the cold air, pulling my coat tighter around me, not because I felt fragile, but because I felt focused. The days that followed were almost ordinary on the surface. I went to work, I answered emails, I smiled at small conversations, but underneath it all, there was a quiet awareness that something had already been set in motion, something that would not stop simply because someone wanted it to. 3 days later, my phone rang. In the early evening, my mother's name on the screen, and I let it ring once, twice, before answering, my voice calm, steady, exactly as it had always been. "Hello," I said, and there was a pause on the other end, not long, but enough to tell me everything I needed to know. "I received a letter," she said finally, her tone carefully controlled, but not quite as smooth as before, and I leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch just enough before I responded. "Yes," I said simply, not explaining, not softening, just confirming, because the letter spoke for itself. She exhaled slowly, and I could almost see her trying to reorganize the conversation in her mind, trying to place herself back in a position of control. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding," she continued, her voice firmer now, more practiced, and I almost smiled, because that was exactly what I had expected. The first defense is always confusion, always distance, always the suggestion that the problem exists somewhere outside of intention. "I do not think there is," I replied quietly, my words measured, leaving no space for interpretation. And there was another pause, longer this time, heavier. "We were helping you," she said, and this time the words came faster, more urgent, managing things, making sure everything was used wisely. And I closed my eyes for just a second, not because I doubted myself, but because I recognized the shift, the move from denial to justification, the moment where the truth is no longer hidden but reframed. I opened my eyes again and looked out the window, watching the streetlights flicker on as evening settled in. "You made decisions without me," I said, still calm, still steady. "And you used what was not yours to use." And the silence that followed was different, not defensive, not dismissive, but uncertain, and that uncertainty was new. I could hear it in the way she breathed, in the way she did not immediately respond, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was softer, but not apologetic. "Not yet. Emily needed a start," she said, as if that explained everything, as if that erased the years of quiet withdrawals, the careful structure that had allowed this to happen without question. And I let her words settle, because they revealed more than any document could. They showed me exactly how she saw this, not as something taken, but as something redirected, something justified by need, by preference, by a belief that one daughter's future mattered more than the other's stability. And I felt that same steady clarity return, stronger now, sharper, because this was no longer about uncovering the truth. It was about acknowledging it fully. "This is not about what Emily needed," I said, my voice low, controlled. "This is about what you chose to do." And this time she did not interrupt. She did not correct me. She did not offer another explanation. And in that silence I understood something important. The story she had relied on for so long no longer worked. Not with me. Not anymore. "What happens now?" she asked finally. And there it was. The question that mattered. Not how this happened, not why, but what comes next, and I allowed myself a small breath before answering. Because this was the moment where everything shifted from hidden to real. Now we follow the process, I said, my tone even, leaving no room for negotiation, no space for reversal, just a clear path forward. And when the call ended a few moments later, I placed the phone down gently and sat there in the quiet, knowing that somewhere else, in a house that had always felt certain and controlled, that same quiet now felt very different, because for the first time, they understood that I was no longer someone they could manage, and that realization had already begun to change everything. The next notice did not go to just one address. It went to both of them, delivered on the same day, at the same hour, because timing mattered now. Timing was part of the structure, part of the message. I imagined Emily opening hers in the middle of her carefully arranged living room, the one she had described with such ease, the one that had felt so secure only days before. And I wondered if she would recognize the numbers, if she would see them not as abstract figures, but as something taken, something carried quietly from one life into another. I did not have to wait long to find out, because that evening my phone rang again, this time her name on the screen, and I answered with the same steady calm I had carried through every step of this. "I got something in the mail," she said, her voice tighter than I had ever heard it, not polished, not rehearsed, just strained. And I leaned slightly against the kitchen counter, letting her speak without interruption. "I do not understand what this is supposed to mean," she continued, faster now, words overlapping. "There has to be a mistake. Mom said everything was handled. She said it was fine." And I closed my eyes briefly, not out of frustration, but out of recognition, because this was the second stage, the one where belief collides with reality and tries to hold its ground. "It means exactly what it says," I replied quietly, not raising my voice, not adding anything unnecessary, just allowing the truth to sit where it belonged. And there was a pause on the other end, followed by a softer, almost uncertain tone. "You are actually doing this," she said. And it was not a question, not really. It was a realization, and I felt something shift again, something subtle but important, because for the first time, she was no longer speaking from confidence, she was speaking from doubt. "Yes," I said, just as simply as before, because there was no reason to complicate something that had already been made clear. She let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but without humor, without ease. "I thought you would understand," she said, and that sentence settled into the space between us in a way that was almost heavier than anything else she had said, because it revealed the assumption beneath everything, that I would accept, that I would adjust, that I would continue to be the person who made things easier for everyone else. And I opened my eyes, looking out at the reflection of myself in the darkened window, steady, composed, unchanged on the surface. "I do understand," I replied, my voice calm, deliberate. "I understand exactly what happened." And this time she did not interrupt, she did not argue, because there was nothing left to reshape, nothing left to soften. The truth had already taken its place. "What are we supposed to do now?" she asked finally, and her voice was quieter now, less certain, and I recognized that question for what it was, not just confusion, but the beginning of consequence, and I let a small silence pass before answering, not to create tension, but to make sure every word that followed would land exactly where it needed to. "You follow the instructions in the notice," I said, evenly, without emotion, because this was no longer about feelings. It was about process, about steps that would move forward regardless of how anyone felt about them. She exhaled again, longer this time, and I could hear something shifting beneath the surface, something that had not been there before, not quite regret, not quite acceptance, but something closer to awareness. And when the call ended, I set my phone down gently and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me once again. But it was not the same quiet as before, it was heavier now, filled with the weight of what had already begun and what would follow, because the illusion had broken, completely this time, not just for my mother, but for Emily as well. And as I turned off the kitchen light and moved toward the hallway, I understood with absolute clarity that there was no version of this where things returned to the way they had been, no careful conversation that could rebuild what had been quietly taken over years. Only one path forward now, one that would unfold step by step, exactly as it was meant to. And And for the first time since all of this began, I did not wonder what would happen next. I already knew the meeting was set for a Friday afternoon, not at my home, not at theirs, but in a quiet office where everything was neutral, where no one could hide behind familiarity or comfort. And when I walked in, I saw them already seated, my mother with her hands folded tightly in her lap, Emily beside her, her posture rigid, her eyes avoiding mine for just a second, before she forced herself to look up, and I took my seat across from them without a word, placing my folder on the table with the same calm precision I had carried through every step of this process. The lawyer spoke first, outlining the situation in clear, measured terms, the kind that leave no space for interpretation, no room for emotion to distort what was already documented, and I watched as each sentence landed, as each detail removed another layer of the story they had been telling themselves. My mother tried to speak once, a quiet attempt to interrupt, to explain, but the lawyer raised a hand gently, not dismissive, just firm, and continued, because this was no longer a conversation that could be redirected. When he finished, the room fell into a silence that felt different from any silence we had shared before, heavier, final, and I let it sit there, not rushing to fill it, not offering comfort, because this moment did not need to be softened, it needed to be understood. Emily was the first to break it, her voice lower than I had ever heard it. "I did not think it would come to this," she said, and I looked at her steadily, not with anger, not with accusation, just with the clarity that had replaced both. "It came to this a long time ago," I replied quietly, because the truth was not something that appeared suddenly. It was something that had been building, piece by piece. Long before any letter had been sent, my mother shifted in her seat then, her composure finally beginning to crack. "We were trying to help," she said again, but the words sounded different now, thinner, less certain, and I shook my head slightly, not in frustration, but in refusal. "You made a choice," I said, my voice steady. "And now there are consequences to that choice." And this time she did not argue. She did not correct me, because there was nothing left to defend. The documents lay between us, clear, undeniable, the result of years that could not be rewritten with a different explanation. The lawyer then outlined the resolution, repayment, timelines, legal obligations that would move forward whether they agreed or not. And I watched as the reality of it settled over them, not all at once, but gradually, the way truth often does when it replaces something that once felt certain. Emily nodded first, slowly, her hands clasped tightly together, and then my mother followed, her shoulders lowering slightly as if something she had been holding onto had finally slipped away. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw them not as they had been in my mind before, not as figures of authority or control, but simply as people facing the result of what they had chosen to do. The meeting ended without raised voices, without dramatic gestures, just signatures, quiet acknowledgments, the sound of papers being moved across a table, and when it was done, I closed my folder carefully and stood up, not waiting for anything more, not expecting apologies or explanations, because those belonged to a version of this story that no longer existed. As I walked toward the door, my mother called my name, softly, uncertainly, and I paused, turning just enough to acknowledge her without fully stepping back into the room. "I did not think you would do this," she said, and I met her gaze for a moment, steady, calm. "That was your mistake," I replied, not unkindly, just truthfully, and then I stepped out into the hallway, the door closing quietly behind me, and as I walked away, I felt something shift inside me, not a sense of victory, not satisfaction, but something quieter, something more complete, the understanding that what had been taken was now being returned, not just in numbers or documents, but in something far more important, the recognition that I was no longer someone whose life could be quietly managed by others. And as I stepped outside into the open air, I took a slow breath, letting it settle, because for the first time in a long time, everything in front of me felt entirely my own.